So, Mr. Designer,
Yeah.
I'm a nonprofit. I want to teach people about something. You know, what questions do you ask? How do you work with these companies? What does the end result end up looking? You know, how do you take those kind of assignments and develop something that creates meaning? And how do you know who to target it to?
Right. Well, first of all, what is the message, right? Like, what exactly are you trying to communicate? And that's evolved quite a bit over time for a reason I'm going to explain in a second. What is success for you, right? Because about 5 years ago, especially in the early days of Games for Change, it was really just about awareness. Let's just raise awareness. I think those is the Darfur is dying days, right? It's like oh, let's just make games that show people that Darfur exists and that horrible things are happening there, and then we're done, right? Yeah. And that left a kind of bad taste in people's mouth a couple of years later about like, well, is that enough?
Did anybody help as a result of having played that game?
So how do we move forward? And then that leads to a real question of assessment, which you always ask in games for social change, because it's not enough to make a game where you sort of think you did okay, right? You have to show that you did something. Did this contribute to? Did this lead to more contribution? Did this lead to engaged activity? And in education in particular, this is a massive subject, right? Because schools don't have the luxury of sort of assuming that things worked. Right. Schools have metrics that they use to judge whether things worked, and those metrics determine whether you get Obama funding. And right?
The initial assessment of Games for Change, the initial ideal application of them was in the school setting at first.
Exactly, and that's where a lot of these lessons were learned. That was like, okay, well, this game we think it sort of taught people something, but we don't really know. So can we prove this? And we're working with School for One right now. And School for One is a New York City public school, so it's tied to the New York City public system and the testing in the New York public system. So what we've basically been tasked to do with a few other developers is make a half-an-hour experience that teaches a lesson, right? Which means at the end of that session, you can take a test and pass the test on the lesson. That's like assessment. The assessment bar is on math, yeah. The assessment bar is as high as it's going to get. And so I think that's always a critical question. And then what you do is you work very closely with the partner, so you, the nonprofit, we would basically sort of propose to you, like, okay, if this is your message, this is sort of how we see we can construct this message into a game experience. Does this match your expectations?
Yes.
Does this actually deliver what you want? And do these metrics that we're measuring in the game, because we can track what players do, we can track how they play and what they earn and stuff. So like, do these metrics map to the kind of activity that you want to incent?
Right.
The other side of that handshake, though, is recognizing that you came to a game, right? You chose to make a game. So you don't go to a musician, like you don't go to a musician and say, hey, I want you to make a song about our non-for-profit, but please don't use any dissonance at all, right? Because that dissonance has nothing to do with our message. It's like, well, then why did you don't come to my band?
Right. Like I'll cover the song. I'll make you a song, but it's going to be my vision. Because I'm a creator. So. Yeah, the important thing that Nick was talking about in terms of actionable result is when you're dealing with Games for Good, you have to have a clear expectation of what kind of results you want to say. I want more people to join my mailing list so that they can be, kept apprised of distributions. People who play the game, like, they would get extra points for putting in their email address. And then you say, this game is successful if I add, 2,500 more people to the group's mailing list. That's an actionable result. And then also, again, knowing your demographic. For example, when Nick did IET, it began in schools and continues to be in schools. That would not be something like, who wants to go to GameStop and be like, should I buy Bulletstorm or a game about like tragedy in Haiti?
They're not even called Haiti.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't win. Just so you know.
Right. So specificity is so important as this field emerges. Knowing the demographic and knowing what actionable results we can get from game design principles.
I have a question. I have a question for Nick. I'm curious. So we've been talking about sort of organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, wanting to use games and that they're funding games. I'm curious to know, from your perspective, do you think that more indie game developers who are kind of on their own, do you think that more indie game developers would be interested, just like they're indie documentary filmmakers who are kind of come from an activist, slant? Do you think that more indie game developers would be interested in sort of this Games for Change kind of space?
Oh yeah, I teach at Parsons, and the student body at Parsons that's interested in social games is just enormous. Parsons is a school that it has an organization called Pet Lab, which is designed specifically around games and social change. It's specifically designed for games and advocacy. But I don't think that's unusual. I think this pops up all over the place. Students tend to be motivated in these directions, and games give them an outlet. There's a couple of issues that come up, I think, that create, well, there's three that I can think of, really. The first is that, as I was kind of alluding to before, people who make games like games and think about games. And a lot of times, and this is changing now, but for a very long time, people would come to games and be like, oh yeah, we really love what happened with Pokemon. Can you make Pokemon for the periodic table of elements, but don't let kids compete, and really don't make it at all about challenge or anything, and just make absolutely sure that you don't ever deviate from anything we ever want schools to be. And it's like, well, games are games, and they work because they're games. They don't work because they're made up of pieces of games.
They're playing Pokemon and not studying for a reason.
Yeah.
So let's exploit that reason.
Exactly.
I mean, exploit is kind of a bad word, but that's really what we're doing. We're using people's natural tendency towards challenge and designed interaction. Exactly.
And we need to leverage, if we're going to use games well, we have to leverage what games do well. And if you don't want to, don't use games. Games are not appropriate for everything. But but games are very good at what they do. Trust the game people to know they're good at what they do.
Yeah.
Right. The second thing I think just has to do with outreach, and I think Games for Change has been really instrumental in helping make this happen, and it's been growing. Just like indie game developers realizing that there are opportunities there. And then the third thing is that I think there's a growing awareness that's coming that you can't do this super cheap.
Right.
Which was what people were trying to do for a very long time.